Perhaps the biggest and hardest period in this church's history was during the 1960s, when the First Presbyterian Church of Crafton and the Bradford Avenue United Presbyterian Church spent the better part of that decade trying to work out a merger between the congregations. In 1963, the First Presbyterian Church voted overwhelmingly to merge, but the United Presbyterian Church rejected the merger by a very slim vote of 54 to 57. But in the ensuing years, dialogue between the churches continued, although at times there were quite a number of disputes about what the merged church would be called and where it would be located. But finally, on September 11, 1966, both congregations voted to unite to become the congregation that we presently are, the Crafton United Presbyterian Church. But beyond leading us through those challenges and hardships during the past 125 years, as I have been reading through the church records recently, two particular recurring themes really jumped off the pages. First, from its very earliest years, this church has always been a church that's had a passion for mission, a passion for carrying the good news of Jesus beyond the walls of this church building. For instance, in 1888, just 3 years after the church was first organized, this congregation responded to a request from residents in Ingram and the surrounding neighborhoods to lead worship services in their community and to assist them in forming a church of their own. Throughout the decades, offering financial support to missionaries and to Christian projects around the world has been a high priority for many church members. In 1971, a hardship fund was set up to assist not only church members, but also people in the surrounding community who were going through difficult times. Sometime around 1980, the church began housing and operating the community food pantry. And over the years, the church has sponsored numerous mission trips for youth and adults, including a 1971 trip to Washington, D.C., a 1978 trip to Kentucky, and mission trips in more recent years to Ohio and West Virginia and central Pennsylvania. But on reading back through the church records, another theme also really jumped off the pages. And that is the historical concern of this church to be in ministry with the children and youth of this community. For instance, in 1990, the session voted to allow boys to help take up the offering during worship services. Apparently a rather bold step for them at that time, but quite obviously an indication of their desire to want to make children more a part of the worship service. In 1967, the session sensed that there was a need to have a minister to the youth of the community. At first, the church asked the other congregations in town to partner with them in that endeavor. But when the other churches declined, this church went forward and created an associate pastor position and called the Reverend Bob Montgomery, who's with us here today, to that work. And it was during his tenure that the first experiments in 1971. In 1969, the preschool began meeting here in the church. And over the years, I was amazed at how many times young people from this church were encouraged not only to take part in summer camp, but also to attend Christian gatherings at the state and national levels. And year after year, the church set aside scholarship money to help make it possible for those young people to attend those camps and conferences. From its earliest days, Crafton United Presbyterian Church has had a commitment to reaching out to the youth of this area. Where we are sitting today, this sanctuary was added to the original church building in 1927. And when the cornerstone for this sanctuary was laid on July 17, 1927, these words were spoken. The present, in some measure, reflects our past and foreshadows our future, thus fully equipped for rendering a larger service. This congregation presses on, mindful of the injunction, not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord. What they were saying there in 1927 was that who we are in the present is in some measure a reflection of who we have been in the past, and in some measure is a foreshadowing of who we will be as a church in the future. And their desire in 1927 was that knowing and appreciating the history of what God had done in their past, they were ready for God to move them forward to even bigger and greater things in the future. May that be our prayer as well. As we gather here today for this church's 125th anniversary, let us come and see what God has done. Let us come and see how God has been with this church throughout the decades, in good times and in bad. And let us come and see the future. Let us come and see the future that God has for this